Well, my comments after Mark and Samir, I am totally intimidated. However, having said that, if I think Mark used this phrase of, if you like, referring to a kind of funeral of a system. Well, in a sense, I see it. I'm at the wake stage, and that's what I'd like to describe. Just by the way, Larry Meniere's book on the humanitarian enterprise, I think is very relevant here as well, if I may just say. I have some comments that just came out of the comments, if I may, before getting on to the points that I actually wanted to make originally. And in a sense, one talks about in this report about the need for, if you like, the traditional system to make and adapt to the changes that are occurring. Let me just say that I think if you look around the world, that no one is waiting for the system's changes. What is out there in the way states are behaving, regional organizations, et cetera, are behaving, shows a transformation which, whether or not the traditional system catches up, is really not relevant, because a much wider grouping, a parallel grouping, is already under change. But let me get back to that in a second. What I'd like to do is, first of all, is to say to Samir and Sarah that this really is a very important report, and I really congratulate you deeply on what I think you've achieved. What I also think is that you've got this particular set of issues at an interesting time. Let me give you two examples. One is, I've just come back from the United States, where I had discussions with various groups, Council on Foreign Relations, the Pentagon policy people, et cetera, et cetera. A consistent theme now is, and you can say, but it's always there, and I'm saying no, a consistent theme now that you hear overtly, as one begins to start seeing the need to justify the expenditures that are going on at a time of, if you like, economic recession. We have to link not aid, humanitarianism, with our national security. This, I think, now gets to be a very, if you like, indicative point of where we are as a, if you like, as an international concerned community. And if you think that's all the obvious, and Mark quoted or referred to Rumsfeld, well, if it's all Pentagonese and CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, etc., let me give you my second incident, and that was, there was a real tension in the DFID-funded Humanitarian Emergency Response Review process. And that tension was that there were some who felt that to justify and to really understand what is happening in the international system, one has to understand that there's mutual self-interest, enlightened self-interest, that one should look at. And it's not necessarily political, but it is a realization of where humanitarian issues are going. That these issues are, if you like, more and more interconnected. The kind of crisis drivers that we have to face are far more complex in so many ways than we traditionally have assumed. So we have not only changing crisis drivers, their dimensions and dynamics, but also the interplay means that the way you're affected is also going to affect me, and this interplay becomes increasingly important. And you can either put it down as enlightened self-interest, which changes the way we look at people from other parts of the world and the way we look at those people in the context of ourselves, or you can say, in a sense, as the Her said, and I think, unfortunately, it's all about the moral imperative. Now, the moral imperative, I believe, in the context of Sarah and Samir's report, is the traditional system. And that's what I'd like to suggest we should take if you like, be aware of. Also, if I may just refer to a point that Mark made, and Mark said that the list of these kind of states goes on and on and on. Well, I'd like to suggest, Mark, that maybe they don't go on and on and on. That really, if you take a look at the interconnected dynamics of crises more and more, what you really find out that there are more sincere states, and the list of states that really are trying to deal with their vulnerabilities and the vulnerabilities in their region is getting to be far longer than we recognize, and that the list of the conflict affected, etc., is probably, if you like, fairly obvious. We know where we are, and we're comfortable there because that's the way and that's the arena in which we like to argue. Now, having said all of that, let me just briefly go down a couple of points. I think we do have to bear in mind that there are new dimensions and dynamics of humanitarian crises, and I'd like to suggest that one of the major transitions that we are seeing, not in terms of a few selected, but across the globe, is that the survival of government is increasingly dependent upon the way they handle their crises. And unless this is deeply understood, and I think the report actually, if you like, comes down that line, that our assistance will have less and less relevance. Having said that, I remember that in a meeting with about 22 governments from various parts of the world, and they were asked, well, what actually do you see as, if you like, the future of humanitarian response? The one thing they urged was, we really do not need your boots on the ground. If you have technical advice, technical solutions, if you can help us with prevention planning and perhaps preparedness, then we value your involvement. But grosso modo, that what we don't need is for your intervention in times of crises. Now, that is just something that I think is worth bearing in mind, and these 22 came from everywhere from the Horn of Africa to South and Latin America. I think the other thing is, then, if you take a look at the dynamics of the global system, another thing to perhaps bear in mind is the role of regional organizations, and I'm not sure we're really capturing that well enough either. Take a look at ASEAN, at ECOWAS. They now are beginning to develop mandates for humanitarian action. How do we, as a traditional set of concerned actors, fit into a set of organizations that have, broadly speaking, two roles? One role is to help states perhaps coordinate, perhaps, but the other role, and you've seen this in ASEAN with Burma, etc., is to act as a shield against the intervention of the outside community. And how do we take that into context, and how do we engage? And I'd like to just put that also on the agenda. You know, another thing, and I think certainly in the report, and certainly Mark has referred to it, and this is the question of our principles. Just a quick vignette. I remember talking to an official at in the ICRC who had just returned from his assignment in the Middle East, and he said, you know, I had the funniest experience, and that was, you know, what we are there to do is to promote the principles. And so I went around telling this. In this particular case, I talked to this audience about our humanitarian principles, our neutrality, impartiality, independence. And he said, you know, it's really interesting. There was a very elegant man who got up in the audience and said, thank you very much. We really appreciate your principles. We have our principles too. And our principles begins with justice. Where do your principles fit with ours? And I think this also has to be taken in the context of, if you like, this transformative world. And isn't it interesting? I mean, even the terminology that we use, non-governmental organizations, well, who else is going to deliver? I mean, where else do you look? Well, I wonder to what extent we take our plans and planning when we go abroad, beyond our own vulnerable societies, into someone else's vulnerable society, and ask the following. Where does state capitalism and state capitalist structures fit into emergency relief? Well, my answer is go to Indonesia, go to Malaysia, see the way increasingly, not private sector, but state capitalist structures get involved in humanitarian assistance. Or let me just suggest this, and something which we all know, but let me just, if you'd like, bring it up, and that is this whole question of where does the diaspora fit into your structures, into your interventions, into your efforts to assist? You know, it's really interesting, just as a by the way, I was talking to colleagues before we came down here for the meeting, and I said, I wonder if you went around the audience, who you would say was the largest non-governmental organization that you know of. And I promised here not to ask that. But having, if you like, said that, you know, I just wondered if anyone, and I'm sure some of you have heard of Muhammadiyah, which has 1 million volunteers in Indonesia. Where do your plans fit, and where do you fit in there? And I remember it was in Jakarta a couple of years ago when I was invited to, if you like, observe the emergency capacity building project, the Gates-funded thing with the major actors. And I looked around the room, and the one thing I didn't see was any organization, any agency from Indonesia. So let me leave this here by saying my congratulations on an excellent report, very, very timely. We are indeed in transformational times. Thank you.